The final inequality that we want to look at when talking about BAME communities is the idea of racial bias. And again, it's not escaping me that I am a white man in a position of power talking about racial bias to students, many of whom will have experienced it. And we know that there is racial bias in our community, in our school community, in Edinburgh as a whole, and recognising that is an important part of doing something about it. And so I want to bring that up right at the beginning. And if you've had experience of racial bias, or you know people who have, and you want to talk about it, talk to me about it, talk to other people about it. It is really important that we recognise that this is happening. But also, I don't want to be in a position where I'm asking people to share things that they're not comfortable with. So, in terms of answering these questions, in terms of what you submit back to me, feel free to be as open and as honest as you like, but also feel free to just do the point explain examples and not feel like you have to engage with the other stuff. I'm not in a position to be adding to trauma today. So, with that in mind, let's think about the concept of racial bias. We know that people of colour are more likely to experience negative treatment based on their ethnicity than white people in the UK. And according to a 2018 study by The Guardian/ICM, that study found that racial bias, where people of BAME communities are treated negatively compared to white people, is a huge problem in the UK. Now, this bias is often unconscious. Open, direct racism, using the N-word, describing people in certain ways based on their ethnicities, that unfortunately is still definitely a problem in many areas of British life. However, there is also a huge problem of unconscious bias, meaning that people don't necessarily realise that they are acting in a racist way, or they don't necessarily realise that the things that they are saying are aggressive or racist, or are building on stereotypes, etc. So that study found that 53% of people from a minority background believed that they had been treated differently because of their hair, their clothes, or appearance, compared with 29% of white people, and that 43% of BAME respondents have been overlooked in a job application or a promotion process that felt unfair, compared to just 18% of white people. And we've talked about some of the figures from this study before. It's also important to note that there's a huge amount of data backing this up. You'll see the image on the Adobe Spark has these two people, a white person with a resume or a CV that says Greg on it, and a black person with a CV that says Tyrone. And this is representing a huge amount of studies that have been done over the years into this idea of how racial bias in hiring presents itself, and in terms of particularly about discrimination. So thousands of studies, maybe hundreds of studies, have been done looking at thousands of respondents into this. And essentially the study is a very simple idea. They take a CV, the exact same CV, and they produce two copies. The only difference on the CV is the name at the top, and they use names that are traditionally white names and names that are traditionally of different ethnicities. So you might have, for example, you might have a name like Stephen, and you might have a name like Rishikesh, or you might have a name like Tyrone, as in the example. And they send these CVs into job applications, all sorts of different job applications, and they look at basically what they get back. And what they found across dozens and dozens of these studies, hundreds of these studies since the 1990s, is that consistently people with white-sounding names are offered more jobs than people with black-sounding names, or at least offered more opportunities for interviews across different countries, across different sectors, across different types of jobs. Consistently, white people or white-sounding names are offered more jobs than black-sounding names. And a recent meta-analysis where they looked at all of these studies together included data from more than 54,000 applications. They found that essentially white applicants received on average 36% more callbacks than black applicants and 24% more callbacks than Latinx applicants with identical CVs. So we can see that there is a huge discrimination problem, particularly in hiring. Now, our example for this is not actually to do with hiring, it's to do with another aspect in terms of policing. Now, we've seen a lot of coverage of the way that particularly black communities in this country are policed, but also communities of colour in general are policed very differently than white communities. And our example for this topic is the discussion around stop and search in London. Police chiefs want to give police officers more options for stopping and searching people. So rather than just saying there is evidence that they've been involved in a crime, or there is evidence they may have knowledge of a crime, therefore we are going to stop and search them, they want to say we can stop and search somebody because they look suspicious, they look a bit funny, I want to stop and search them. Or they have the potential to commit a crime, I want to stop and search them. And what we know is that when these criteria are introduced, this idea of looking suspicious or they have the potential to commit a crime, people of colour, and in particularly black people, are far, far more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. Because essentially, unconscious bias is telling police officers that people of colour look suspicious. People of colour have a higher chance of committing a crime. David Lammy, who is a London MP and Shadow Justice Secretary, has said that this whole process leads to racial bias. And we know that a study has found that black people are 9 times more likely than white people to be checked for drugs, despite using illegal substances at a much lower rate. So collectivists argue that racial bias not only affects people directly in terms of racist language and actions, but also systematically, affecting decisions made about hiring people, healthcare priorities, and education. And they look at the evidence of the studies that we've talked about. They look at the evidence of kind of promotions. They look at the surveys that we've talked about, and in particular the Central for Social Investigation did one of these identical application studies, and they found that 24% of white British applicants received a call back, as in please come and interview, we like it, compared to only 15% of ethnic minority heritage. And particularly what they found was that people of Middle Eastern and North African heritage had to make 90% more applications than white British people to get back the same amount of responses. So the only difference is that these people have names like Ahmed or Muhammad, and yet they, rather than more white-sounding names, and yet they had to make nearly twice as many applications. Individualists, on the other hand, would say that many of these studies are based on whether people feel like people used racial bias against them. More than 50% of BAME respondents to the Guardian ICM study had not been the target of racist language in the last 5 years, so that's nice for them. You know, individualists would say that this is playing the race card, which is not a thing, and that real racism is at an all-time low. So individualists would argue that it may be that people are kind of feeling like they're not getting what they want because of racism, but they're actually not getting what they want because of all sorts of other factors, and they're just using racism as an excuse, which obviously, as soon as you say that out loud, just sounds ridiculous. But they would argue that actually hate crimes and kind of use of racist language, etc., is on an all-time low, and that real racism isn't really happening. We know that that's kind of nonsense.